The jet was already surrounded when the first crate was opened. Soldiers stood frozen as bricks of cocaine stacked higher and higher. 5.7 tons in total, worth more than $100 million. Sitting inside a single DC-29 aircraft on a Mexican runway. But the most terrifying part of this moment was not the drugs. It was where the money came from. Before we go further, tell me where you are watching from in the comments, because this story stretches across borders faster than law enforcement ever could. And if you love scam stories where banks quietly help criminals move mountains of money, subscribe to Scamsphere, because what you're about to hear only gets darker. When investigators traced the ownership of that cocaine plane, they did not find some underground kingpin with fake passports and offshore hideouts. They found paperwork. Clean paperwork. Bank transfers, wire records, traveler's checks, all pointing back to one of America's largest and most respected banks, Wachovia. Between 2004 and 2007, Wachovia quietly became a financial highway for Mexican drug cartels, primarily the Sinaloa cartel. During that period, the bank processed approximately $390 billion in tax transactions tied to cartel-controlled currency exchange houses. That number is so large it almost loses meaning. To put it into perspective, it was roughly 1/3 of Mexico's entire economy at the time. This was not loose change slipping through cracks. This was a river of money flowing straight through the U.S. financial system. The laundering was not sophisticated in the way Hollywood portrays it. It was bold. It was repetitive. It was obvious. Mexican currency exchange houses, known as casas de cambio, deposited massive sums into Wachovia accounts. Travelers' checks arrived in perfect round numbers. Serial numbers were sequential. Deposits spiked suddenly with no explanation. These are textbook red flags. Every anti-money laundering manual on earth says stop, investigate, report. Wachovia did none of that. Instead, the bank processed bulk cash shipments, international wire transfers, and millions in travelers' checks with barely a question asked. Cash flown out of Mexico, converted through exchange houses, then wired into Wachovia accounts in the United States. From there, the money was clean. It could buy aircraft, real estate, weapons, silence. Inside Wachovia, at least one man knew exactly what was happening. Martin Woods, a former British drug enforcement officer working in the bank's London office, began flagging transactions that screamed criminal activity. He filed report after report. He warned management repeatedly. He explained that these patterns matched cartel laundering operations he had chased for years in law enforcement. His warnings were ignored. Executives told him the clients were too valuable. Compliance concerns were treated as inconveniences. The money kept coming, and Wachovia kept taking it. Woods eventually realized the bank was not missing the crime. It was tolerating it. The full scope became clear when U.S. authorities connected the money trail to real-world violence. The same accounts used at Wachovia were funding aircraft later seized with tens of thousands of kilograms of cocaine. Planes bought with laundered money flew drugs across continents. Cartel wars, fueled by those profits, left thousands dead across Mexico. And still, the money flowed. From 2004 to 2007 alone, Wachovia provided banking services to more than 20 Mexican exchange houses. Nearly $400 billion passed through these channels. Even when internal reviews admitted the risk was extreme, the bank chose profit over protection. It was not ignorance, it was indifference. When regulators finally stepped in, the evidence was overwhelming. Wachovia had violated basic banking laws designed to stop drug money. The bank admitted it failed to maintain effective anti-money laundering controls. Yet the punishment would shock the world. In 2010, Wachovia reached a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. government. No executives were charged. No prison sentences were handed down. The bank paid $160 million in fines and forfeitures. That amount represented a tiny fraction of what it earned during the laundering years. To the cartels, the message was clear. The cost of doing business was low. The irony was brutal. Wachovia's annual profits dwarfed the penalty. The fine did not even equal 2% of the bank's earnings. In practical terms, laundering nearly $400 billion resulted in a financial slap on the wrist. By the time the deal was signed, Wachovia itself no longer existed as an independent entity. It had been absorbed by Wells Fargo during the financial crisis. The scandal faded quietly. Headlines moved on. The system reset. But the damage was already done. By the time the laundering pipeline finally snapped into public view, the damage had already been done. The money was gone, the violence was paid for, and the blood was already dry on the streets where cartel wars had raged. Wachovia's role was no longer a theory or an allegation. It was documented, quantified, and undeniable. Nearly $400 billion had moved through one American bank, quietly, efficiently, and with astonishing indifference. When investigators reviewed the records, the scale stunned even seasoned agents. This was not a single rogue branch or a handful of careless employees. The laundering spanned years, departments, and continents. It passed through compliance desks, executive reviews, and internal audits without being stopped. Red flags were not missed. They were tolerated. Wachovia executives knew that Mexican currency exchange houses were among the highest-risk clients in global finance. These institutions existed in a landscape dominated by drug cartels, bribery, and violence. Yet Wachovia continued to service them, even as transaction volumes exploded beyond any reasonable commercial explanation. The money arrived in round figures, perfect batches, and repetitive patterns that screamed criminal origin. Inside the bank, the warnings became impossible to ignore. Compliance officers raised concerns. Internal reports flagged abnormal activity. But each warning collided with the same invisible wall. The clients were profitable. The revenue was enormous. The risk was theoretical, while the money was real. And so the system did what it always does. It chose profit. The laundering was simple, almost insultingly so. Cartel cash was delivered to currency exchange houses in Mexico. From there, it was converted into traveler's checks or wired directly into Wachovia accounts. Bulk cash shipments crossed borders. The bank processed it all. No meaningful verification. No aggressive questioning. No intervention. Once inside the U.S. banking system, the money was effectively reborn. It could buy aircraft. It could finance logistics networks. It could pay bribes, fund assassinations, and sustain drug wars that left entire regions destabilized. Wachovia did not pull the trigger. It funded the gun. As the investigation deepened, authorities uncovered chilling connections between laundered funds and real-world crime. Aircraft purchased through Wachovia-linked accounts were later seized carrying massive cocaine shipments. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pipeline where money became machinery, and machinery became violence. Yet, when the reckoning arrived, it was strangely quiet. In 2010, Wachovia entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. government. The bank admitted failures in its anti-money laundering controls. It agreed to pay fines and forfeitures totaling $160 million. No executives were charged. No admissions of intentional wrongdoing were required. No prison sentences followed. The contrast was grotesque. Nearly $400 billion laundered, $160 million paid. To the public, the number sounded large. To the bank, it was negligible. Less than a rounding error compared to the profits earned during the laundering years. Wachovia treated the penalty as a cost of doing business. The executives who oversaw the operations walked away untouched. This outcome sent a message louder than any press release ever could. Banks were too big to jail. Institutions could facilitate mass crime so long as they cooperated after the fact. Accountability would stop at the corporate level, never reaching the individuals who made the decisions. The human cost, meanwhile, was never part of the settlement discussion. Thousands died in cartel violence funded by laundered money. Communities were torn apart. Entire regions were destabilized, but those consequences did not appear on balance sheets or court filings. Shortly after the settlement, Wachovia disappeared into history. The bank had already been absorbed by Wells Fargo during the financial crisis. The name faded. The scandal became a footnote. The system moved on. But the precedent remained. The Wachovia case exposed a dangerous truth about modern finance. Banks are not passive observers of crime. They are critical infrastructure. Without access to legitimate financial systems, cartels cannot scale. Without banks willing to look away, global laundering collapses. Wachovia did not fail to detect crime. It failed to act against it. Even more disturbing was how predictable the outcome had been. Whistleblowers raised alarms early. Compliance failures were documented. Regulators were warned. Yet intervention came only after years of unchecked laundering. And when it did, it arrived with forgiveness, not punishment. The message to future criminals was clear. If you move enough money through the right institutions, consequences become negotiable. This is why the Wachovia scandal matters. Not because it was the first case of bank laundering, but because it showed how normalized such behavior had become. $400 billion flowed through a respected American bank, and the system responded with a fine and a handshake. No executives lost their freedom. No careers ended in disgrace. Bonuses were paid. Promotions continued. The machine absorbed the scandal and rolled on. Meanwhile, the cartels adapted. They learned which banks were cautious and which were convenient. They refined their techniques. They exploited the same weaknesses again and again. The war on drugs, loudly proclaimed by politicians, quietly collapsed in the vaults of major banks. Wachovia became a symbol of institutional immunity. Proof that financial crime on a massive scale could be settled quietly, without spectacle, without justice, and without lasting reform. Today, the case remains one of the largest money laundering scandals in American history. Not because it was clever, not because it was hidden, but because it was allowed. The cocaine plane was seized. The money was not. And if you think this scam was disturbing, wait until you hear about the next one, because there are laundering operations even larger, quieter and more protected than this. And if you do not want to miss the next story where power erases consequences, subscribe to Scamsphere, where every billion-dollar illusion eventually leaves a trail.